This move, 1. c4, initiates the English opening, a flexible system that aims to control the d5 square and often leads to complex pawn structures and strategic maneuvering rather than immediate tactical skirmishes. Developing the knight towards the center is a flexible move, preparing to challenge White's control of d4 and potentially leading to a variety of Indian defenses. Maintaining central tension. This move, nc3, is a flexible response to the Indian defense, allowing White to maintain central control and prepare for various pawn structures while developing a piece efficiently. Black enters a symmetrical English opening by mirroring White's pawn advance, immediately contesting the center and creating a flexible pawn structure that can transpose into various openings. This move develops a piece and prepares to castle, maintaining flexibility in response to Black's Sicilian-like setup and preventing immediate pawn advances by Black. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop and aims to establish a solid pawn structure, often leading to positional battles in lines related to the Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian defenses. This move prepares to fianchetto the kingside bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the d4 pawn push later in the game. This move prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and create pressure against White's kingside. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing to castle kingside and control key central squares. The move b-7 develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to pressure White's center, particularly the d4 square, and supporting the eventual d5 pawn push. This move completes kingside development, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks, which is a standard and logical step in this Maroshi bind setup against the English opening. This move solidifies White's pawn structure in the center, preparing to develop the bishop and potentially control key central squares. This move aims to fianchetto the queen's bishop on the long diagonal, supporting the center and preparing to challenge Black's light-squared bishop. This move prepares to castle kingside, solidifying the pawn structure and connecting the rooks while also bringing the bishop into play on a natural diagonal. This move boldly challenges the center, aiming to open lines and potentially create an isolated pawn for Black after cxd4, offering active piece play for White. This move resolves the tension in the center and leads to a symmetrical pawn structure, which is typical of certain lines in the English opening, often transposing into Queen's Indian or Catalan-like setups. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially initiate an attack on Black's kingside while also developing a piece. This move prepares to develop the queenside pieces by creating space for the queen's knight and potentially supporting a b5 pawn advance to challenge White's queenside control. This move activates the bishop to a powerful diagonal and pressures Black's queenside development, while preparing to potentially exchange on c5 or continue its influence. Castling to the king's side secures the king and connects the rooks, preparing for central play and potential pawn advances. This move efficiently centralizes the queen's rook, preparing to contest the d-file and support potential pawn advances in the center. This prophylactic move addresses the potential for nc3 to be pinned by b-4 and also prepares to reposition the knight to a more active square, possibly c7 or d7, to support central pawn breaks. The bishop repositions to b2, aiming to control the long diagonal and support a potential queenside pawn advance. This move, nd7, supports the central pawn advance d5 and prepares to reroute the knight to potentially f5 or e6. creating more active play in the center and kingside. This pawn push establishes central control and opens lines for the king's bishop, preparing to challenge black's kingside majority and potentially launch a central pawn storm. This move initiates a dynamic central pawn exchange, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and knight. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to support a potential e5 pawn push and potentially challenge black's knight on c5 or assist in maneuvering the rook to the d-file. This move prepares to reroute the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting the advance of the d-pawn or challenging white's central control. The knight advances to d4, contesting the center and preparing to potentially exchange on c5 or jump to f5, aiming to control key squares in white's central advance. This move develops the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially support a kingside advance later. This move aims to prevent black's knight from potentially advancing to g4 or h5, offering white better control over the kingside and maintaining a solid pawn structure. The move 16. rc8 is a good positional move that prepares to contest the semi-open c-file and supports the knight on circa 5, aiming to gain space and potential counterplay against white's central pawn structure. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside aims to gain space and disrupt black's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while preparing for a subsequent advance of the f-pawn. This move prepares to support the central pawn advance of f5 and prevents white's g4 gram5 pawn push from opening lines on the kingside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, seeking to exploit the space advantage and create attacking opportunities against black's potentially weakened kingside pawn structure. The knight retreats to h7, a somewhat passive square, to avoid the immediate threat of the pawn advancing to f5 and to potentially redeploy to g5 or f6 later, while also allowing the g-pawn to advance further or prepare for other pawn breaks. This move repositions the queen to support the e4 pawn and potentially prepare for a kingside attack by clearing the central files for other pieces. The rook's relocation to a7 initiates a strategic maneuver, aiming to support a potential queenside expansion and defend the pawn on a6 from any future pressure along the second rank. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, reinforcing the central pressure and potentially opening lines for an attack against black's king. The bishop retreats to a8 to avoid the threat of the pawn on g4 and to potentially redeploy to a more active square later, perhaps via b7 or c6, to support the central pawn push. The rook redeploys to a more active file, supporting the e-pawn advance and preparing to contest the central open files. This move, 21, bf6, repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest the central light squares and potentially prepare for a later exchange or attack on the kingside. This move initiates a kingside pawn storm, aiming to open lines against black's castled king and create attacking opportunities. This pawn thrust directly challenges white's central pawn control and seeks to create dynamic counterplay by opening lines on the kingside, albeit at the risk of weakening black's own pawn structure. This pawn capture opens the h-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking possibilities against black's kingside and forcing black to address the immediate threats. This capture opens up the h-file for black's rooks and potentially creates weaknesses around white's king, but it also grants white's queen freer access to the kingside. This pawn capture on g5 opens the f-file for white's rook and aims to exploit black's exposed kingside, creating tactical possibilities and potentially weakening the pawn structure around the black king. This recapture on g5 is a critical decision, opening up the h-file for white's rook and potentially creating dynamic play. But black must be vigilant about the knight on d7 potentially becoming a target. The rook is redeployed to the d-file to support the pawn advance, control the open file, and potentially prepare for future operations on the kingside or central files. The knight retreats to d7 to reposition for a potential kingside attack or to support the e5 pawn push, aiming to consolidate the position after the pawn exchange. This move prepares to bring the rook to the d-file, aiming to contest black's control and potentially apply pressure along the open lines that are starting to form, while also reinforcing the kingside defense. The knight's centralizing jump to e5 is an active move, aiming to control the key d3 and f3 squares while potentially preparing for further central pawn advances or an attack on white's kingside. This move prepares to double rooks on the h-file, aiming to exploit the open lines and target black's king while simultaneously pressuring the g5 pawn and potentially preparing an attack along the third rank. This move reinforces the e-file control and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece activity on the kingside, further solidifying black's position. This move repositions the knight from its potentially vulnerable central square, aiming to free the e-file and prepare for a potential knight transfer to either the kingside or queenside, depending on white's further plans. This move re-establishes control over the c-file, preparing for potential action against white's queen or center pawns and reinforcing black's defensive posture. This move aims to gain space on the queenside and restrict black's pieces, potentially preparing for a pawn advance with b5 or to open lines for white's rooks. This move repositions the queen to a more active diagonal and prepares to potentially support the g5 pawn or shift to the kingside for defensive or offensive purposes. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to support a potential kingside pawn push or to contest the d-file if black advances their pieces further. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the central pawn push and potentially challenge white's kingside initiative by creating counterplay on the d-file. The move qh2 is a strategic repositioning of the queen, aiming to secure the king on the h-file and potentially prepare for a kingside attack or reinforcement, while also keeping an eye on the central squares and the potential for further pawn advances. This move f6 by black is a critical defensive reaction, aiming to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prevent white's intended pawn storm initiated by g4 and h4. This move reroutes the rook to a more active square, aiming to support the central pawn push with d4 or to contest the d-file, while preparing for potential breakthroughs or defensive maneuvers on the queenside. This move prepares to challenge the open g-file, aiming to trade off white's active rook and relieve the pressure on black's kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's g5 pawn and prepare for potential kingside advances. This exchange on d4 is part of a complex positional battle where black aims to exploit white's slightly awkward pawn structure on the kingside. By capturing on e4, black opens the g-file and creates potential tactical threats against white's king. This move activates the rook on the open d-file, attacking black's overloaded defender on e4 and preparing to exploit the weak dark squares around the black king. This move activates the queen to pressure white's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially support a counter thrust on the kingside if white fails to adequately defend. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's weakened kingside and support white's central initiative. This move is a brilliant check that forces white's king into a vulnerable position, aiming to exploit the open lines and material imbalance created by the preceding exchanges. This move is a necessary repositioning of the king to escape the immediate check and centralize it, preparing for potential king safety issues and future defensive maneuvers. The bishop retreats to c5 to avoid capture and maintain its active diagonal, aiming to potentially support future pawn pushes or create threats on the queenside. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, white simplifies the position and eliminates black's active attacker on the e3 square, aiming to leverage the open c-file and pressure the weak pawns. The capture of the bishop on c5 opens the c-file for white's rook, but black has regained material equality and disrupted white's coordination, potentially creating an outpost for the knight on e4. The move 38, Road 4 activates the rook on the 4th rank, preparing to contest the d-file and support potential pawn advances while also potentially unpinning the bishop on c5. This move of exchanging the active bishop for a knight simplifies the position and removes a significant attacking piece for black, albeit at the cost of opening up the h-file for white's rook and potentially weakening black's kingside further. This move directly attacks the black bishop on e3, forcing it to retreat and allowing white to consolidate material advantage while aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure black created with f6. This move seeks to activate the knight on e5, aiming to put pressure on white's queenside and potentially exploit the open c-file if white commits to further pawn advances. The rook on h3 is now actively participating in the defense of the kingside and prepares to potentially support a g4 gram5 pawn push to dislodge black's knight. This move capitalizes on the undefended g5 pawn, activating the knight to a central outpost and simultaneously attacking the undefended rook on h3, creating immediate tactical complications. This move decisively re-engages the queen, targeting the weak pawn on g5 and preparing for potential exchanges to simplify the position. This forcing check is black's only move to avoid immediate material loss and exploit white's compromised kingside, aiming to regain initiative by disrupting white's pieces. This move continues the aggressive queen sacrifice line and aims to exploit the exposed black king by repositioning the rook to the critical kingside square where it can support a potential mating attack alongside the queen and other pieces. This move forces the white king into a difficult position, leveraging the discovered attack and the open b-file to create immediate threats and disrupt white's coordination. White aims to activate the rook on d1 to defend the king and prepare for counterplay on the open files, leveraging the discovered attack on the black rook if it were to move from b1. This move, k4, initiates an attempt to complicate the position by forcing exchanges and potentially exploiting the loose black king, but it must be carefully calculated due to the potential for tactical skirmishes that could backfire. This move aims to bring the rook into the defense of the kingside by repositioning it to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside pawn push or preparing for further coordination with the other rook. This move is a desperate attempt to exploit the unprotected king after white's queen moved to g3, forcing an exchange and hoping to regain material or achieve a mating attack. After a complex tactical exchange leading to the current king's precarious position, King g1 aims to escape the immediate checks and seek safety on the kingside, while white hopes to consolidate and prepare for defense. Black's recapture on g2 is a tactical blunder, allowing white's king to escape the immediate check and opening lines for an attack after the inevitable discovers on the queen. This king sacrifice aims to exploit the open diagonals and coordinate the rook and queen to force a perpetual check or win material after black's king is exposed. The king has been forced to wander into the open, drastically compromising its safety after white's successful queen sacrifice and knight fork. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a potential kingside attack or to recapture material, as well as to defend the king more effectively. The knight's move to a8 aims to support the rook on g7 and potentially reposition for defense or to re-engage on the kingside, although the immediate threat from white's rook and queen is significant. This move forces the black king into an exposed position on the open c-file, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure and potentially create mating threats by coordinating with the other rook. This move seeks to consolidate the king's position after a series of exchanges and captures, aiming to defend against further checks and prepare for potential counterplay. This rook lift aims to activate the rook on an open file, threatening the 7th rank and potentially supporting a king hunt or creating further tactical opportunities by swinging to the kingside. This move is a desperate attempt to activate the knight, which has been poorly placed, by bringing it to a more active square and potentially preparing to defend the weakened kingside. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the kingside or supporting an advance.